America's rivers have often been called the country's first interstate highways. They served as lifelines for the Mississippi and for ancient cultures which thrived along their banks. During the colonial period, the Ohio River became the gateway to the West. By the late 18th century, thousands of boats floated down these waterways. Goods from Fort Pitt could travel down the Ohio into the Mississippi, reaching New Orleans and beyond to the rest of the world. The most common vessel for cargo transport was the flatboat. These disposable one-way crafts dominated river trade in the 18th and 19th centuries. Bulky and difficult to maneuver, they needed only to float downstream. Basically, they were log cabins on rafts. Cheap, easy to build, and a prime target for Miami and Shawnee raiders who controlled the lower Ohio before the 1790s. As Native American raids declined, a new threat emerged: river piracy. Many desperate men and women turned to banditry, exploiting the underdeveloped Midwest. One of the most notorious figures among them was Samuel Mason. Born in Virginia in 1739, he later moved with his family to Western Virginia near present-day Wheeling, West Virginia. During the Revolutionary War, he served as a militia captain in the Virginia State Forces, fighting for the Patriot cause. He participated in the First Battle of Fort Henry in 1777 and narrowly survived an ambush later that summer. After the war, Mason settled in Washington County, Pennsylvania, where he lived the typical pioneer lifestyle until around 1784. On the surface, Mason appeared to be an upstanding settler, a patriot, landowner, and a family man. However, beneath this facade, he was drawn to shady dealings and dubious associates. He had a history of horse thievery, which continued even during his military service. His reputation suffered further when two of his associates stole horses from guests at his own daughter's wedding. As his standing in the community collapsed, Mason sold his 500-acre property to settle debts and moved his family to Kentucky in the late 1780s. By the mid-1790s, the Masons had settled in Red Banks, now Henderson, Kentucky, along the lower Ohio River. It wasn't long before Mason turned to full-fledged criminal activity. Watching flatboats drift past daily, laden with valuable cargo, he saw an opportunity. But before embracing piracy, he first clashed with the local constable, Captain John Dunn. Dunn had opposed Mason's presence from the start, refusing to sign a document Mason sent him, and openly calling him a rascal. Days later, Mason's gang ambushed and nearly beat Dunn to death. Remarkably, Dunn survived and later led a rescue party to save a slave woman and her 2 children, who were abducted by the Mason gang. Determined to eliminate Dunn, Mason sent his eldest son, Thomas, into Red Banks to confront him. Instead, Thomas encountered Dunn's cousin, Thomas Durbin, who tried to reason with him. Thomas Mason responded by shooting Durbin dead and fleeing the town. With pressure mounting, the Mason gang relocated downstream to Diamond Island, where their river piracy intensified. Dunn remained in their crosshairs, and in late 1797, he was shot from his horse. He later died in his cabin, likely assassinated by a member of Mason's gang. Diamond Island, a large, heavily wooded landmass on the Ohio River, west of Henderson, proved an ideal base for piracy. The river narrowed around it, making it easier to ambush passing flatboats. Mason's gang lured boats to shore, robbed the crews, and often killed them, dumping their bodies into the river. The stolen cargo was then sold to crooked merchants, specializing in illicit trade. Eventually, the locals had enough. A militia was formed and launched a surprise attack on Diamond Island. Some gunfire was exchanged, but the pirates put up little resistance. 3 or 4 were shot, but the Masons escaped alive. They moved further downriver, eventually establishing their most infamous hideout, Cave-in-Rock. Located in southern Illinois, Cave-in-Rock is a prominent limestone bluff with a deep cavern-like opening. Though not technically a cave, it had the appearance of a classic pirate lair, an ideal place for hiding stolen loot. Mason adopted the alias Wilson and turned Cave-in-Rock into a rest stop for weary boatmen. His gang even erected a sign as sort of an 18th century billboard which read, "Wilson's Liquor Vault and House for Entertainment." Travelers, drawn by the promise of hospitality, were lured in, only to be robbed or murdered. Cave-in-Rock attracted all sorts of outlaws, including the infamous Hart brothers, often called America's first serial killers. They were responsible for around 40 murders in Kentucky and East Tennessee. Though often linked to Mason's gang in folklore, there is little historical evidence of a direct collaboration. By 1797, Mason's gang moved further downriver, until it emerged with the Mississippi. Records of his activities became sparse, but he remained active. When flatboats delivered cargo in New Orleans, the crew didn't return home by river. Flatboats weren't built for upstream travel. Instead, they journeyed overland via the Natchez Trace, an old Native American trail running through Mississippi, Tennessee, and Kentucky. Unfortunately, this trail was also infested with highwaymen and bandits, and Mason saw new opportunities for plunder. Mason resurfaced in 1800 when he obtained a passport in New Madrid, which is in present-day Missouri, granting him permission to travel through Spanish Louisiana. On the west side of the Mississippi, the Masons appeared to live a lawful pioneer life, but on the American side, they continued attacking flatboats, abducting and trafficking slaves, and robbing travelers along the Natchez Trace. He became known both as Samuel Mason, the river pirate, and Mason of the Woods. In 1801, a merchant named Colonel Joshua Baker fell victim to Mason's gang not once, but twice. He was first robbed on the river and later again on the Natchez Trace. Outraged, Baker wrote to the Mississippi Territorial Governor, William C. Claiborne, warning of Mason's growing menace. His letter mentioned that Wiley Harp, also known as Little Harp, the surviving member of the notorious Harp brothers, was among Mason's men. This claim caught the governor's attention, as the Harp's brutal crimes were infamous across the frontier. Governor Claiborne forwarded Baker's report to Spanish Louisiana's Governor General Manuel de Salcedo in New Orleans, urging action against the Mississippi River Pirates. Both governors launched separate campaigns to eliminate the threat. Meanwhile, Mason and his gang roamed Arkansas and Upper Louisiana with little concern for Spanish authorities, as their crimes had primarily occurred in the U.S. territories. The Louisiana territories briefly went back into French hands, but Spanish forces remained there to maintain law and order. By 1802, Mason had a $900 bounty on his head. He continued his criminal activities until January 1803, when officials in New Madrid received a tip that his gang had been spotted in a small settlement of Little Prairie. They had taken over an empty home in the area, which raised suspicion among the locals. The house was surrounded by militia, and Mason's family and his band of cutthroats had no choice but to surrender. By the time he was captured, his bounty had increased to $2,000. They were taken to New Madrid and their trial began on January 17th of 1803. Samuel Mason argued that he was just your regular pioneer and that all these haters were out to get him. One of his associates by the name of John Seton claimed that the Masons practically kept him prisoner and he was forced to commit robbery. When the authorities searched through the gang's belongings, they found guns, gold, silver, and $7,000 worth of banknotes. The most alarming find was the collection of 20 human scalps. That was enough to convince the authorities that they were pirates all right. But since the crimes were committed in the U.S. territory, the prisoners were prepped to be transferred to the Americans. Mason's family and his men were loaded on a boat and sent down the Mississippi, destined for New Orleans. During transit, Samuel Mason and two others, John Seton and James May, somehow got their hands on a gun and overpowered the guard. During the scuffle, Mason was shot in the head and dropped, but he got back up, and he, along with Seton and May, made their escape. Governor Claiborne slapped another $500 onto Mason's bounty, totaling to $2,500. Which was a lot of money back then. When John Seton got wind of the price on Mason's head, he got an idea. He could betray Mason and collect the bounty himself. He didn't seem to like him anyway. It's not clear whether or not Seton and James May betrayed Mason by killing him or just waited for him to die of his gunshot wound. But in one version, Seton brained Mason with a tomahawk and chopped off his head. They rolled his head in blue clay to keep it from getting putrid, and rowed a canoe into the Mississippi territorial capital of Natchez. They brought the robber chief's head to the authorities, hoping to claim the high reward. But instead of getting their payout, they were immediately recognized as members of Mason's gang and taken into custody. The two men were tried and sentenced to death, and on February 8, 1804, John Seton and James May were executed by hanging in Greenville, Mississippi. The field where they were hanged was named Gallows Field thereafter. As for Mason's family, not much is known. It's said that his wife went on to live an honest life in Old Shankstown, Mississippi. River piracy continued until around 1830. After the riverways became increasingly patrolled and regulated, it died out soon after. There were other river pirate gangs here and there, but none reached a level of fame as Samuel Mason. That's all for this video. Feel free to like and subscribe, and take care.